This is a video tutorial of the Isobel Dress view C. This is the one with the unlined bodice and the neckline is finished with self-bias binding. So we're going to start off with the bodice first. That was 2 ties that I had there, a back bodice cut on the fold and a pair of front bodices, also a pair of sleeves. Now I forgot to include the neck binding, which also should be included there. Okay, so to make the ties, we fold the ties in half lengthwise with right sides together, and then you're going to sew a 5 to 6 millimeter seam, which is around about 1/4 inch. I've chosen to cut the ties on the bias because I've got a striped fabric and I think it just looks better. Now to turn the ties to the right side, I'm using a hairpin or a bobby pin. And I've just made a cut near one end on the folded side of the tie, poked the end of the bobby pin into the tube, and now I'm just turning those to the right side. Now the narrower you do your ties, the harder it is going to be to turn it. But definitely if you can persevere, narrow ties do look better than big thick ones. Okay, so I've got the pair of bodices with right sides together. We're going to sew from the waist edge up to the neck at the center front edge, which is roughly halfway up. And that is a 2 centimeter seam or 3/4 inch. Press that seam open and then press those raw edges in again 1 centimeter. And then we're going to press that flat again. So we've got a clean finish to that center front seam, which is really important because for this style, the wrong side of the fabric does flip out when the ties are undone. And so I've just gone over to the sewing machine and I'm just stitching down the edges of that seam on both sides. Okay, now with right sides together, of the front and the back bodice, we're going to sew the shoulder seams with a 1 centimeter seam, which is 3/8 inch. If you have an overlocker, you can then overlock these seams, and if you don't, you can just do a zigzag stitch at the edge of your fabric. Press the shoulder seams towards the back of the garment, and now we're ready to put on the self-bias binding. So with the right side out, we're going to fold that bias binding in half, and I've just folded that short edge in 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 inch. Line that edge up with the center front edge of the bodice, and then we're just going to sew this bias binding around. Now we're going to try really hard not to stretch the neckline of the bodice. We're going to use the natural stretch of the binding to ease around those curves. And this is a 6 millimeter seam or 1/4 inch. Before you get to the end, if you've got any excess, just trim it and fold that end of the binding in 1 centimeter, just like we did for the start. Okay, and now we can understitch the seam. I am going to use a scrap of fabric, which I've just folded up to make it a bit thick. And I'm sliding it in behind the presser foot, and that just helps the machine to start on that quite thick edge there. Domestic sewing machines aren't that great at going over bumps, and that really helps get that seam started. Okay, so understitching that seam. So I'm sewing quite close to the seam there, and this understitching will just help the binding roll really easily towards the inside of the garment when we come to top stitch the neckline. Okay, now we can attach the ties before we top stitch the neckline. I'm just going to trim back some of that seam allowance right at the center front there, because there are quite a few layers of fabric there now. And then we're going to put the ties in, which makes it quite thick. So if you can just trim that back a little bit, it really helps. Now I'm sewing the ties to the center front edge. I'm attaching them directly under that neck seam. You really want these ties to be right at the top of that neck edge. So right underneath that seam is where we want to put them, and then when we fold the neck binding in towards the wrong side of the garment, you'll see that the tie is right at the top there, which is exactly where we want it. Okay, now we're going to top stitch the neckline, roughly 8mm, or what is that? What is 8mm in inches? I can't really remember, but it's less than a centimetre, so less than 3/8 of an inch. And I just use that scrap of fabric again just to help start at that thick edge there. Okay, and try and keep this top stitching really even from the finished neck edge. It's going to make if you look at the finished neck edge as opposed to the inside edge of the binding, you're going to get a better result. Okay, so the neck binding is finished and the ties are attached. Now we're going to get the sleeves. We've got a pair of sleeves. They have a center neck, they have a double neck for the back and another single neck for the front. And we just need to put a gathering stitch in between those necks. So that's in between the front and back neck. Okay, right sides together, we're going to find the center neck, which we can pin to the shoulder, the single neck, which goes to the front of the bodice, and the double neck goes to the back. Make sure you know which is your left and right sleeve. So the back of the sleeve dips down at the sleeve hem, so we know that that has to go towards the back of the garment. Now I'm just using that gathering stitch to gather in that sleeve head, and the rest should all match up with the bodice. Now we're sewing a 1 centimetre seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. And I'm just, when I come to the gathered part, I'm just using my snips to make sure that the gathering is really even. We don't want clumps of gathering and then other spots which are quite flat. We want it really nice and even. Okay, and if you've got an overlocker, go ahead and overlock that. Now I've done both sleeves and overlocked those seams, and I've pressed the seams in towards the neckline. Okay, now we're going to move on to the skirt. So we've got 2 pairs of pocket bags. We've got the hem ruffle, which is cut to on the fold, and we've got a front and back bodice, front and back skirt, which is cut to on the fold. So with right sides together, we're going to start to sew in the pockets. Make sure that your pocket bag is up the right way. So the hem obviously is straight across, and the waist edge has those angles cut out of it. So we found the necks where we matched up the pockets, and we sewed in from the bottom neck 1 centimetre, pivoted, sewed up 1 centimetre, and then back out at the next neck. Now we need to clip into those corners, and you need to get quite close into that corner so that you don't have any puckering when we turn it to the right side. I've gone and overlocked in between those cuts that I've just made, and I've been over to the iron just to press that seam flat, and now we're going to understitch in between those necks. And again, the understitching is just going to help the pocket roll really cleanly towards the inside of the pocket. Okay, so we're just turning out those corners, and you can iron that so it's nice and flat. You should have some pretty nice sharp corners with no puckering if you've clipped well into those corners. Okay, grab a pocket bag, put right sides together, and now we're going to join those 2 pocket bags together with a 1 centimetre seam, which again is 3/8 of an inch. So we're only joining the pocket bags here. We are not sewing the actual skirt panel. Overlock around that pocket bag, and now we just have to secure the openings of that pocket so that it's easier to join it to the back skirt when we're ready. So I just sewed about 6mm from the side edge there. Okay, so put both of your pockets into the side seams, and now we need to put a gathering stitch along the top edge of the waist. So I'm sewing approximately 6mm down, or 1/4 inch, and I'm using a long machine stitch size so that we can gather that in easily. And so you match up the centre nicks, the centre nick of the skirt with the centre front seam of the bodice, and the nick at the side matches up with the bodice side seam. Okay, so gathered in the excess fabric at the front, and I'm just sewing a 1cm seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. Again, just making sure that my gathers are really even, and I like to use my snips to sort of squash those gathers down and make sure that my presser foot doesn't sort of spread them out and do annoying things like that. Okay, so 1cm seam that was, and I've done the front and the back now, and I've been over to the overlocker, and then I pressed those seams upwards. So now with the front and back of the front and back dress right sides together, we can close the side seams. So again, we're sewing a 1cm seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. Now when you're sewing past these pocket bags, just make sure that you do not catch the pocket mouth in the seam. So you just need to feel along, and when you get to the corners, you might need to move that pocket mouth aside a little. Okay, so I've done both side seams, and I have overlocked those seams, and a good idea to go and press those side seams, and that's the finished pocket bag there. Now we can create the tunnel for the sleeve elastic. So as I mentioned before, the back of the sleeve dips down at the sleeve hem. So, and I've just done a little gathering stitch just around that back curve, because we're going to be double turning the fabric to make a tunnel or a channel, and because that curve is an outie curve, it can be a bit tricky to double turn. So if you do a little bit of it's like when you put a sleeve into an armhole, you always do a not a gathering stitch, but you stitch around the sleeve head and then you ease it in, and it's much easier to get into the armhole. So it's a similar sort of idea. Okay, so I'm sewing that elastic tunnel, and it's approximately 8mm, or a bit less than 3/8 of an inch, just enough so that you can thread your 1/4 inch or 6mm wide elastic through. If you want to use a different size elastic, that's fine. You can just work out how wide your tunnel needs to be. And I've just used a small safety pin to thread the elastic through. I'm just using a needle and thread to join the elastic. I find narrow elastic quite tricky to do at the machine, so I just do it with a needle and thread, and then just use the machine to close up that gap. And okay, so we're moving on to the hem ruffle now. Right sides together of those hem ruffle panels, and we're going to sew the sides 1cm or 3/8 of an inch. And then you can overlock those side seams and press the seams towards the back. Then we can hem this panel. So just do a small hem. I'm just double turning approximately 6mm. You can do a centimetre if you like, you can do whatever you like. I do find that with these ruffle hems, a small hem looks the best. And I'm just double turning with my fingers. I don't recommend trying to press this hem first. It's actually quite tricky to press a really tiny hem. If you're using something like linen or cotton, it actually should be easy enough just to turn it with your fingers. Okay, now I've gone to the top edge of the hem ruffle panel, and I've set my machine to a longer stitch length for the gathering stitch, and I've stitched right around that ruffle, but I've stopped and started at both side seams so that I've got a tail that I can pull to create the ruffles. So I've matched up the centre front and centre back necks and the side seams, and then I'm just going to pull those threads at the sides to create the gathers. And of course, try and get your gathers as even as possible. Okay, and then we can go over to the machine and sew all around this seam 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. Some people like to do 2 rows of stitching when they do gathers. That's absolutely fine. You can do whatever you're used to, whatever you feel comfortable with. I just have always done 1 row of stitching and I find that sufficient. Okay, and then I've overlocked that seam and pressed the seam upwards. And the last thing to do is just to knot those ties, and the garment's actually finished. So head over to my Etsy page to view this listing and other women's and children's patterns. Hope you've enjoyed this video, maybe learned something, and thanks so much for watching.